The chicken arrived in a burlap sack. That was how Nora Voss first laid eyes on the Dominique hen. Not perched in a clean coop, not strutting a county fair pen, but upside down in a flour sack on the bench seat of a rusted wagon, feet tied with twine, feathers the color of a thundercloud gone still. The man selling them had been trying to get rid of them for 2 seasons. 10 hens and a single cockerel. 11 birds in total, and he was asking $4 for the lot. He said it like he was confessing something embarrassing. $4, and he'd thrown in the sack. The whole county had an opinion about what Nora Voss did next. She paid the $4. 2 springs earlier, she had been laughed clear out of the Harmon County Grain Exchange when she asked whether anyone still kept Dominiques. The old man behind the counter, his name was Felt, and he wore his authority like a second coat, had looked her over the way a man looks at weather he does not respect, and he said, "Young woman, those birds have been replaced by proper breeds. What you want with a scrub hen nobody's raised since before the war." There had been laughter. She remembered the quality of it, not cruel exactly, just absolute, the laughter of people who considered the matter already settled. She had nodded and walked back out into the heat. Being right, she had already begun to understand, is its own kind of reply. You simply have to be willing to wait for it. 3 years earlier, she had come to the 40 acres outside of Grattan in the autumn, following the death of her father and the dispersal of her family's goods. The land had come to her because no one else would take it. Her father's creditors had inventoried everything of value and left her what remained. 40 acres of thin, clay-heavy soil with a creek that ran barely 3 inches in August. A leaning barn the neighbors had already marked for salvage in their minds, and a house that let the cold through its walls like a suggestion. Her 2 older brothers had taken the good parcel and the team and the cash savings, and when the papers were settled, they had looked at her with something between guilt and relief, the way people look when they have done a thing they do not intend to examine too closely. She was 22 years old, alone on 40 acres, and the consensus in Grattan was that she would be gone before the snow came. The snow came. She stayed. That is the whole shape of the story, though the shape does not reveal the texture of it, the way she rationed the lamp oil by November, the way she counted the remaining potatoes by lamplight in December, setting them out one by one on the earthen cellar floor, and doing the arithmetic with the focused calm of a woman who cannot afford the luxury of panic. 41 potatoes, 11 weeks until March. She needed to make them stretch, and she did, because stretching is what you learn when nothing is handed to you and everything depends on seeing clearly. It was the arithmetic that saved her in the end, not the potatoes, the habit of counting, the habit of asking when she looked at a thing, not what it appeared to be, but what it actually did. Old Emile Horak, whose 40 acres bordered hers on the north side and who had been farming that clay since before Nora was born, noticed the habit. He noticed it the way a man notices a true level, because it is rare and because it matters. He came by the following spring with a jar of rendered lard and a practical eye, and they talked about the creek and the soil and what could be coaxed from ground like this if a person was willing to think sideways. He was a bohemian immigrant, wire-thin, with a white mustache and the patience of a man who had already outlasted 3 hard decades on this land. He had words for things that other people did not have words for yet. Bad land, he told her, standing at the edge of her north field with his boot toe testing the clay, is only bad land until someone learns its language. He said it without drama, the way you state a fact about weather or water. She wrote it down that evening in the back of her father's account ledger, the only blank pages she had. She thought about it often over the following months. She thought about it when she looked at the flock, 11 birds, the last confirmed breeding group of purebred Dominiques in the county, possibly in the state. What she had was not valuable in the way that a thing is considered valuable. It did not weigh much. It did not fill a granary. No one was offering to buy it. But she had begun to develop a suspicion, and it lived in her like a coal-banked low under ash. The Dominique was the oldest American chicken breed anyone had recorded, older than the country's roads, older than most of its institutions. It had been the farmyard bird of the Revolutionary era, the bird that had crossed the plains and wintered in sod houses and scratched out a living on grain sacks when there was nothing better. It was hardy in a way that the newer, sleeker breeds were not. It did not require coddling. It did not collapse in heat or shut down in cold. It laid through the thin months when other hens went silent, and it raised its own chicks without a second thought, which was a thing the popular breeds of 1887 had been bred out of almost entirely. And it was nearly gone. The newer breeds had replaced it, the Plymouth Rock, the Wyandotte, the big broiler-type birds that the Hatchery catalog celebrated in colored engravings. Those birds grew faster, or laid more in a peak year, or impressed a judge at the county fair. The Dominique's virtues were quieter virtues: endurance, self-sufficiency, adaptability, the stubbornness to survive on very little and keep producing. These were not virtues that showed well in a catalog. They were, Nora Voss thought, exactly the virtues required on 40 acres of clay in Harmon County. By the second week of March she had her 11 birds housed in the tightest corner of the barn, bedded on clean straw, with a simple feeder she had built from scraps of timber and wire mesh. The rooster, she had let her neighbor's daughter Agnes name him because Agnes had turned up at the fence every morning, without fail, and it seemed ungrateful not to honor that level of devotion. Agnes named him General with complete seriousness, and General he became. He was a handsome bird in an understated way, his feathers barred in dark slate and clean white, and he conducted himself with a formal dignity that Nora privately found hilarious and never said so. The 10 hens she catalogued in the ledger. She noted their comb shape, their weight by rough estimate, their laying patterns once they settled in. By April she was recording 2 or 3 eggs a day from the group, which was modest. By May she was recording 5. By June the whole flock had steadied into a reliable rhythm, and she counted 37 eggs in a single week and sat with that number in the lamplight for a long time. She told no one. This was deliberate. She had been mocked for acquiring the birds. She had stood at Gruber's dry goods while Adelaide Gruber explained to the woman beside her, just slightly too loudly, that Nora Voss was wasting what little she had on barnyard garbage. She had absorbed the verdict of Felt at the grain exchange and the amused sympathy of the Harmon County women who brought her charity preserves in October, as if she were already a case of confirmed failure. She had taken all of it in and said very little and kept working, and she was not ready to expose what she was building to the town's opinion until it was past the point where their opinion could touch it. So she kept the numbers in the ledger and kept the ledger under her mattress and kept her face neutral at the post office. The birds thrived. This was not magic, and it was not luck. It was the Dominique's actual nature, meeting conditions it was built for. The thin, weedy pasture along the creek that Nora could not plow and could not afford to fence properly was, to the Dominiques, a running buffet. Insects, seeds, tender new grass, the soft-bodied things that hid under the creek bank stones. They ranged over every inch of that poor land and found nutrition in it that a pampered breed in a proper hen house would have ignored entirely. They required far less purchased grain than she had budgeted. The savings were small in any given week, but she tracked them to the cent, and they added up with the slow, satisfying logic of a column of numbers finally balancing. By October of that first year she had hatched 2 rounds of chicks and kept the best pullets. She now had 22 birds. She had also quietly sold 4 dozen eggs over the summer to a cook at the Grattan Hotel, a small, exacting French-trained man named Renard, who had tasted one of the Dominique eggs, studied it the way a man studies a banknote he is not sure is genuine, and looked up at Nora with an expression of frank reassessment. "The yolk," he said. "What do you feed these birds?" She told him they fed themselves mostly. He bought every egg she had to sell from that day forward, and paid above the going rate without being asked, because he knew value when he tasted it. That was her first believer. She tucked the knowledge away like Renard tucked his best knives, carefully in the right place, where it would be available when needed. Emil Horak came in November with his white mustache and his weather eye, and he walked the flock in the yard and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You have something here, Nora." He said it the way he said all true things, without emphasis, as a statement of plain fact. She nodded and said she knew that. He said, "The town will not know it until someone forces them to look." She said she was not in the business of forcing anyone. He smiled at that. He said she did not need to force them. She only needed to be patient and let the thing speak in the language of numbers, because numbers are the only language that men who have already made up their minds are willing to hear. She thought about that all winter, while the snow came down over the 40 acres and the Dominiques moved calmly through the yard, their barred backs dark against the white, scratching methodically at the frozen earth, unbothered, as if cold were simply another condition to be worked within rather than a catastrophe. The second year was the year the production became unmistakable. She had 41 birds by April. By July she had hatched 3 more clutches with an average hatch rate that she noted in the ledger with quiet satisfaction, 83% against the 50 or 60% she heard other farmers report with their commercial breeds. The Dominique hens sat their own nests without complaint and raised their chicks with a focused competence that reduced her labor enormously. She was not supplementing with a brooder stove. She was not losing chicks to exposure in the night. The hens were doing the work themselves, the way they had been doing it on American farms for 100 years before someone decided they were obsolete. She was selling eggs to Renard, to 2 families on the North Road, and now to a dry goods merchant in the town of Elford, 12 miles east, who had heard about the hotel eggs and asked to carry them. She was selling breeding pairs to a farmer named Stottlemyre, who had gotten curious and ridden over to look at the flock, expecting to be unimpressed, and had left with 2 pairs and a notebook full of questions about feed management and hatch rate. She had not advertised any of this. The town was beginning to notice the way a town notices things it has decided to ignore, sideways uncomfortably, with the particular irritation of people who are revising a settled opinion and do not wish to be observed doing it. Adelaide Gruber had asked at the post office whether Nora Voss was running some kind of poultry operation out there. She had asked it with a careful lightness, as though the answer didn't particularly matter to her. Nora had said she kept a few birds, yes, and changed the subject. She had walked home through the summer dust and permitted herself a very small, private satisfaction, the kind you feel when a long-held patience begins to justify itself. It was Clarence Holt who arrived in the 3rd spring with the shine and the danger on him. Holt was the sort of man who wore a town well, pressed, measured, with the steady geniality of a man who has learned that friendliness is more useful than honesty. He represented the Harmon Valley Poultry Exchange, which was less a cooperative than a mechanism by which Clarence Holt aggregated birds and eggs from small farms at the lowest price he could negotiate, and sold them at the highest price the market would bear, with the margin being Clarence Holt's considerable living. He had heard about the Dominique operation, he had heard about Renard's eggs and Stottlemyre's breeding pairs and the Elford account. He had done the arithmetic in his own way, and arrived at the Voss farm one Tuesday morning in April with a smile and an offer. He called it a partnership. She listened to the whole proposal with her hands in her jacket pockets and her face still. He would market the birds and the eggs through his exchange network at scale. She would supply the flocks. He would handle the business complexity. He said this with a gentle emphasis that implied the business complexity was beyond her, and she would receive a fair portion of the proceeds. He named a figure. She looked at the figure. She looked at Holt. She said, "That's 30%. He said that was correct, and that was a generous arrangement for a supplier, and that he would be managing all the risk of the market side. She said she would think about it. She said it pleasantly, the way you say something you have no intention of agreeing to. And she walked him back to his horse, and he rode away satisfied that the thinking about it was a formality, because women alone on 40 acres did not generally turn down certainty. He did not know about the ledger. He did not know about Renard's standing order at above market rate, or the letter she had received in February from a seed and livestock dealer in the capital who had heard, through a chain of quiet word, about the last breeding population of purebred Dominiques in the state, and who wanted to discuss the possibility of a supply agreement for fertile eggs. He did not know that she had spent the winter reading everything published in the agricultural circulars about heritage breed scarcity and the early signs of interest among serious poultry breeders who were beginning to understand that the traits being bred out of the popular commercial varieties were not coming back easily. What he knew was the surface of her situation. He had looked at 40 acres of thin land, a leaning barn, and a woman alone, and he had assumed the usual summary. He came back 2 weeks later. She was not home. She was in Elford, finalizing the supply arrangement with the dealer there. And he spoke instead to Emil Horak, who happened to be mending fence on the property line when Holt rode up. Horak was old and accented and quiet, and Holt was the sort of man who did not guard his speech around old, accented, quiet men. He said he was hoping to lock up Nora Voss's supply before she talked to too many other people. He said she'd come around a woman in her position. It was only a matter of the right framing. Emil Horak listened to all of this and offered no particular response. He went on mending the fence. Holt rode away. And when Nora returned from Elford that evening, Emil was sitting on her porch with his jar of lard and a second piece of information she did not yet have. She listened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He said what exactly?" And Emil repeated it with the precision of a man who had listened carefully because he knew he would be delivering the words to someone who deserved to hear them accurately. She nodded. She said she thought so. She had, in fact, signed the Elford agreement that afternoon. 65% of retail price on hatching eggs, with volume guarantees on both sides, and a clause that allowed her to supply additional buyers, provided they were not direct competitors in the same market territory. She had written the clause herself in the careful handwriting of a woman who had spent 2 winters reading every contract and agricultural agreement she could lay hands on. The dealer in Elford had read it, looked up, and said he had not expected that kind of language from a... And then he had stopped and said the price was acceptable. The weather broke in June in the wrong direction. It had been dry, drier than anyone could remember, drier than the oldest records in the county courthouse, though the courthouse had burned in 1879, and the records were not all that old. The creek dropped to nothing in July, the corn began to curl in August, and by the 3rd week of August the situation in Harmon County was as clear and terrible as a blue sky over a dying field. The harvest was going to fail, not partially, not the careful middle-distance failure that farmers could absorb with careful savings and a willingness to go thin for a year. The harvest was going to be a ruin. The large poultry operations, the ones that had been pointed to, in the years Nora had been building quietly as evidence of the right way to do things, were among the first to show the damage. Their high-production breeds required purchased feed, substantial purchased feed, and the price of that feed was climbing with a speed that made grown men speak very quietly over supper. The fine broiler breeds that had replaced the old self-sufficient barnyard birds were not built to range and forage. They stood in their pens and required feed that now cost more than the birds would sell for. The Dominiques ranged. This was the central fact of the drought summer as it pertained to Nora Voss's 40 acres, and it was a fact that resisted being argued with. The birds she had spent 3 years breeding were doing what they had been bred over a century of American farmyard selection to do, finding their own food, reducing their own demand, continuing to lay through conditions that had shut down the production of every commercial flock in the county. The creek was gone, but the creek bed was not. It was a long thread of damp, insect-rich, seed-thick ground running the length of her property, and the Dominiques worked at dawn to dusk with the same methodical focus that Nora brought to her ledger. She was still producing eggs in August. She was almost the only person in Harmon County who was. Renard at the hotel came to her in the second week of August with his hat in his hands and an expression of naked relief, and asked whether she could supply the hotel exclusively for the rest of the summer and into the fall. He named a price that was twice what he had been paying. She told him she had a prior commitment to the Elford account, but that she would supply him at current rate, the same rate he had been paying, not the double desperation price, because it was fair and because she was not in the business of making a meal out of a man's difficulty. Renard stood very still for a moment. Then he said, in the quiet voice of a man who does not praise easily, that he wished there were more people who did business the way she did. She thanked him and got back to work. Word gets around a county like Harmon County the way water finds the lowest ground, without effort along whatever channels happen to be open. By September, the channels were all open, and what was running through them was the fact of Nora Voss's uninterrupted laying flock on 40 acres of poor clay ground in the worst drought in local memory. Farmers who had never spoken to her drove out to look. They stood at the fence line and watched the Dominiques moving through the dry pasture and the fallow creek bed, and their faces showed a complicated mixture of feelings that Nora recognized from her own first years. The particular discomfort of being shown that something you had decided was worthless had gone on being valuable without your permission. She answered questions. She showed the ledger numbers, not all of them, but the production figures and the hatch rates and the feed cost comparisons. She was direct and informative without being self-congratulatory, which was not difficult because she had never been the sort of person who needed to say, "I told you so" aloud when the facts were saying it perfectly well on their own. Old Felt from the grain exchange came one afternoon in September. He came alone, which she thought spoke well of him. He stood at the fence with his hat at his side and looked at the flock for a long time. He said he had been wrong. He said it plainly, without dressing it or minimizing it. She said she appreciated that. She meant it. She understood what it cost a man like Felt to stand at a fence and say that to a woman he had laughed out of his exchange 3 years before. She showed him the ledger. She explained what she had built and how she had built it, and she was generous in the explanation, the way you are generous when the battle is already won, and generosity costs nothing but pays a great deal. It was Clarence Holt who arrived in October with a different sort of energy. The drought had not been kind to Holt's exchange operation. The farms he represented were producing almost nothing. His network of suppliers had contracted sharply, and the buyers he supplied were still buying, still needing, still presenting invoices that he could not currently fill. He needed what Nora Voss had, and he knew by now that she knew what she had. The pleasant framing and the gentle implications about business complexity were not going to work a second time. And so he came with the other kind of pressure. He had spoken to the county assessor, he said. There were questions, he said, about the valuation of the land and the structures. He said it carefully, threading the concern through several layers of apparent friendliness before he arrived at the point. There was a possibility of a reassessment, he said, and reassessments on active commercial livestock operations sometimes ran higher than people expected, and if there were back taxes owed, which there might be if the operation had been underreported, Those taxes would need to be settled promptly, or there were legal mechanisms. She let him finish. She said, "How did you know the production volume?" He stopped. She said it again, calmly. She said she had not told him the production volume. She said the Elford dealer had a confidentiality clause in his agreement. She said the only person who had access to her ledger was Emil Horak, who kept his own counsel, and Renard at the hotel, who was not the sort of man to gossip with a paltry middleman. She said she was curious how Clarence Holt knew enough about her operations revenues to speak to the county assessor about potential back taxes on a figure he should not have known. Holt was quiet. She said she had filed her tax records accurately and on time, every year, which he was welcome to verify at the courthouse. She said she had kept every receipt and every ledger page, which she would happily present to the assessor directly. She said she thought that conversation would be very interesting, and she would look forward to it, and he was welcome to arrange it at his convenience. He left without the arrangement he had come for. He did not come back. Nora Voss wrote a letter to the agricultural dealer in the capital 2 days later and confirmed the terms they had discussed in February. She set the price for the fertile hatching eggs at a figure that was fair and sustainable and that reflected the actual rarity and actual value of what she had. And the dealer wrote back in 10 days and agreed to it, and said he expected demand to exceed her current capacity by spring, and asked whether she would be in a position to expand the flock. She wrote back and said she would look into it, which was true. She had already been looking into it since July. The winter that year came early and came hard, which was its own kind of mercy after the drought, breaking the dryness and refilling the creek and driving a cold clarity over the county that felt, to those who had survived the summer, like the world starting over with better intentions. She expanded the flock over the winter and into the following spring. She hired Agnes's older brother, a serious young man of 16 named Caleb, who had spent 2 summers watching the Dominiques from his sister's vantage point at the fence and had acquired, by simple proximity and observation, a better working knowledge of the breed than most people twice his age. She paid him a real wage, not a courtesy wage, and gave him responsibility for the morning rounds, and he took to it with the particular focus of a young person who has been trusted with something that matters and does not intend to waste the trust. Agnes herself remained at the fence most mornings, and by the second spring she had named 26 individual birds and could identify each of them by comb shape, which was a level of dedication that Nora found genuinely useful and privately delightful. When a buyer came in the spring to look over the breeding stock, he pointed to one of the hens and asked about her production history, and Agnes, who had appeared at Nora's elbow without any particular announcement, said the hen in question had maintained consistent laying through December and January both, and had hatched 2 clutches the previous year at full viability. The buyer looked at Agnes. He looked at Nora. Nora said that was accurate, and Agnes was their record keeper. The buyer wrote a substantial order. By the second spring after the drought, there were 6 hatcheries in the state carrying Dominique hatching eggs and breeding stock sourced from the Voss line, which was how people had begun referring to it in the trade circulars, the Voss line. She read that in print the first time and sat with it for a while, not with pride exactly, but with the particular feeling of something that has been believed in silence finally being spoken aloud by the world. Emil Horak came for coffee in April, as he always did, when the ground began to soften and the work of the new season was becoming visible at the edges of the fields. He was slower now than when she had first known him. He moved the way old men move when they are moving carefully to preserve what they have left, but his eyes were still clear and his coffee still strong, and he still had opinions about the land that were worth more than most people's certainties. She told him about the 6th hatchery. She showed him the letter. He read it and set it down and drank his coffee and looked out the window at the flock moving through the thawing yard, There were over 90 birds now, barred and calm and purposeful, working the ground with the unhurried thoroughness of animals that have never been told they are supposed to be obsolete. Emil said, "Bad land is only bad land until someone learns its language." He said it the same way he had said it 7 years earlier on the north field boundary, as a statement of plain fact. But this time he was looking at the birds, not the ground, and they both knew he was not talking about the land at all. She said, "I wrote it down the first time you said it." He smiled into his coffee. He said he knew she had. They sat in the warm kitchen while the Dominiques moved through the April mud outside, and the ledger sat on the table between them, 9 years of entries in Nora's careful hand. The columns of numbers running from those first cautious tallies, 2 eggs, 3 eggs, 5, all the way through the drought summer's vindication and the hatchery orders of the present season. And the numbers added up the way a true thing adds up, consistently and without argument, and told a story that did not require any other telling. 40 acres of thin clay on a weak creek at the edge of a county that had laughed. 11 birds in a burlap sack. A woman who had learned to read the language of the land, and the language of patience, and the language of numbers, who had banked a coal low under ash, and waited until the world had no choice but to see the light, and who had chosen, when the light came, to share it rather than hoard it, because she understood, the way Emil understood, the way the land itself seems to understand, that the most valuable things are not the ones that survive at the expense of everything around them, but the ones that have learned over a long and stubborn history how to make something from almost nothing, and keep going, and keep laying, and refuse to disappear. The hens were still out there in the morning when she came to the door with her coffee. The light was low, and the yard was soft, and they moved through it the way they always had, steadily, without drama, finding what was there, as if abundance were simply a matter of knowing where to look.